Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can, not through chaos or randomness, but through the methodical precision of a killer who turned the nation's lifeline into a corridor of death. We're about to delve into a mystery that paralyzed 7 communities across 3 states, where a single individual transformed ordinary train stations into hunting grounds and left a legacy so disturbing that railroad companies suppressed the details for decades, fearing the economic collapse that truth might bring. It was the year 1947. Post-war America was experiencing unprecedented prosperity and optimism. Soldiers were returning home, the economy was booming, and the nation's railroad system was the arterial network pumping life into every corner of the country. In the rural stretches between Chicago and St. Louis, however, the situation was far different. There, along a particular branch line operated by the Illinois Central Railroad, a darkness was gathering that would challenge everything Americans believed about safety, community, and the anonymity of modern travel. The whistles that announced arriving trains, those familiar, comforting sounds that signaled connection to the wider world, were about to become harbingers of death. The Illinois Central Railroad's branch line 47 was not a prestigious route. It was not the gleaming express that carried businessmen between major cities, nor was it the luxurious passenger service advertised in glossy magazines. This was a milk run, a local service train that stopped at every small station along a 230-mile stretch of increasingly rural territory, serving communities that existed primarily to support the agricultural economy of central Illinois and eastern Missouri. 7 stations defined this route, each separated by roughly 30 to 40 miles of farmland, forest, and increasingly isolated prairie. Their names were unremarkable, the kind of place names that appear on maps but rarely in conversation: Meadowbrook, Hickory Bend, Ashfield, Riverside, Pleasant Grove, Waynesboro, and finally, Millerton. Small communities, most with populations under 500 souls, where everyone knew everyone, where doors remained unlocked, and where the arrival of the evening train was often the most significant event of the day. Picture these stations as they existed in that pivotal year of 1947. Not the grand terminals of urban centers with their vaulted ceilings and marble floors, but simple wooden structures, often painted in the railroad's signature green and cream colors, weathered by decades of sun, rain, and snow. Each station consisted of a small waiting room with hard wooden benches, a ticket window that doubled as a telegraph office, a pot-bellied stove for winter warmth, and a single platform extending perhaps 50 feet along the tracks. Behind each station, a water tower loomed, those distinctive wooden structures that allowed steam locomotives to replenish their boilers. The landscape surrounding these stations varied subtly but significantly. Meadowbrook, the northernmost stop, sat in gently rolling farmland where corn and wheat stretched to every horizon. The station itself was positioned at a crossroads where a single paved highway intersected with a network of gravel roads leading to scattered farms. On clear days, you could see for miles witness to the vast openness that characterized this part of Illinois, an openness that somehow made the isolation more pronounced rather than less. Traveling south, the terrain gradually shifted. By the time you reached Hickory Bend, the 3rd station on the line, forests began to encroach. Dense stands of oak, hickory, and maple pressed close to the tracks, creating tunnels of green in summer and skeletal corridors in winter. The stations themselves seemed to recede into the landscape, as if nature was slowly reclaiming what human ambition had temporarily borrowed. Riverside and Pleasant Grove marked the transition into truly remote territory. Here, the forests gave way to marshland and prairie, areas where development had never quite taken hold. The stations served not towns but collections of homesteads, with the nearest actual community often miles away down rutted roads that became impassable in spring. The train was not merely convenient here. It was essential, the only reliable connection to the outside world for much of the year. The people who used these stations reflected their environments: farmers traveling to market, salesmen making their rounds with sample cases, young people departing for opportunities in distant cities, elderly folks visiting relatives, the occasional stranger passing through, and strangers were noted, remembered, discussed. In communities, this small and unfamiliar face was an event worthy of comment. The trains themselves followed a predictable rhythm. The morning northbound departed Millerton at 6:45, reaching Meadowbrook by 11:30. The evening southbound left Meadowbrook at 4:15, arriving at Millerton by 9:10. These schedules varied only slightly for weather or mechanical issues. You could set your watch by the trains, and many people did. The whistles that announced their approach, 2 long blasts, 1 short, 1 long, were as much a part of daily life as church bells or factory sirens. Each station had its station master, usually a semi-retired railroad employee who sold tickets, handled telegraph messages, maintained the building, and ensured safe operations. These men knew every regular passenger by name, knew their families, their troubles, their triumphs. The station master's role was part clerk, part social hub, part community guardian. In the fall of 1947, these men would find themselves thrust into roles they never imagined: witnesses to horror, keepers of terrible secrets, haunted by questions they could never fully answer because something changed in September of that year, something subtle at first, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away through coincidence or natural causes. A shift in the atmosphere, as imperceptible as the first chill of autumn, but far more ominous. The trains continued their runs. The whistles continued to blow. But death had boarded at some unnamed point along the route, and it was traveling with purpose, with patience, with a terrible, calculated precision that would not become apparent until it was far too late. The first victim was Martha Henley, 43 years old, a widow who ran a small boarding house in Meadowbrook. She was unremarkable in every way that mattered to a killer, which is to say, she was vulnerable without being obvious, routine without being predictable, alone without being isolated enough to raise immediate alarm. September 17, 1947, a Wednesday. Martha took the evening southbound train from Meadowbrook, heading to Hickory Bend to visit her sister, a trip she made roughly once a month, usually staying overnight before returning the next day. The station master at Meadowbrook, Harold Prescott, remembered selling her the ticket, smiled as always. He would later recall. Asked about my wife's hip, said she'd made extra preserves for Clara's family, normal as sunrise. Martha boarded the train at 4:20 p.m. 6 passengers entered at Meadowbrook that evening. The conductor, Thomas Riley, remembered her specifically because she sat in her usual spot, third car, left side, window seat. She carried a small carpet bag and wore her good traveling coat, dark blue wool with black buttons. These details, mundane at the time, would become precious fragments of evidence later. The train reached Hickory Bend at 5:38 p.m. 4 passengers disembarked. Martha Henley was not among them. Her sister, Clara Morehouse, waited at the station until the train departed. Concerned but not yet alarmed, delays happened, plans changed. She returned home, expecting a telephone call with an explanation. The call never came. By the following afternoon, when Martha failed to arrive on the morning northbound, Clara contacted Harold Prescott in Meadowbrook. Yes, Martha had definitely boarded. Yes, he was certain. No, there had been no change of plans mentioned. The Illinois Central Railroad initiated a standard missing passenger inquiry. Conductor Riley was interviewed. He remembered Martha boarding. He did not specifically remember seeing her during the journey, but this was not unusual. Conductors moved through the cars periodically, not continuously. She could have been dozing, reading, looking out the window. Had she gotten off at an earlier stop? Perhaps Ashfield, the small station between Meadowbrook and Hickory Bend. The station master at Ashfield, an elderly man named Vernon Mills, had been on duty. Only one passenger had disembarked there that evening, a young man traveling to his family's farm. He remembered no middle-aged woman in a blue coat. The railroad's inquiry concluded with frustrating ambiguity. Martha Henley had likely left the train at one of the stations and failed to inform anyone of her change in plans. People had lapses of judgment. Perhaps she'd met an acquaintance, accepted a ride, suffered some personal emergency that prevented communication. Without evidence of foul play, the matter was closed. A missing person report was filed with local authorities. Life continued, except Martha Henley never contacted anyone again. Her boarding house sat empty. Her bank account remained untouched. Her clothes, her belongings, her entire life remained in Meadowbrook, waiting for an owner who would never return. 3 weeks passed. The leaves were turning gold and crimson across Illinois when the second victim disappeared. His name was Robert Bobby Tinsdale, 29 years old, recently discharged from the Navy, working as a farmhand near Riverside while saving money to start his own garage. Unlike Martha, Bobby was young, strong, capable, not the kind of person who simply vanished. October 8, 1947. A Wednesday. Bobby boarded the evening southbound at Riverside, heading to Waynesboro to look at a used tractor he hoped to purchase. The station master, Eugene Cross, knew Bobby well. The young man often traveled back and forth along the line looking for equipment and parts. Bobby was cheerful that evening, optimistic about the tractor, planning to return the next morning if the deal went through. He never arrived in Waynesboro. The station master there, William Hadley, had been expecting him. Bobby had sent a telegram the previous day confirming his arrival time. When he didn't disembark, Hadley assumed the plan had changed. It wasn't until Bobby's employer contacted Eugene Cross 2 days later that alarm bells began ringing. The railroad inquiry was more thorough this time. 2 disappearances in 3 weeks, both on the evening southbound train, both without explanation. Conductor Riley was interviewed extensively. He remembered Bobby boarding at Riverside, a regular passenger, hard to forget. But somewhere between Riverside and Waynesboro, encompassing 2 stops at Pleasant Grove and at Waynesboro itself, Bobby Tinsdale had ceased to exist. The railroad brought in company investigators. Every employee on duty that evening was questioned. Maintenance crews examined the tracks for signs of accident or foul play. Could someone have fallen from the train, jumped, been pushed? The terrain along that stretch was rough marshland and scattered forest. A body could lie undiscovered for months. Search parties formed. Local volunteers walked the route between Riverside and Waynesboro looking for anything. A piece of clothing, disturbed earth, any sign of tragedy. They found nothing. And then, in a development that would later prove sickeningly significant, the pattern broke. The next disappearance occurred not on a Wednesday, but on a Thursday. Not from the evening southbound, but from the morning northbound. October 16th. Elizabeth Carson, 36 years old, a schoolteacher from Pleasant Grove, boarded the morning train heading to Meadowbrook for a teachers' conference. She never arrived. The conference organizer filed an inquiry when Elizabeth failed to appear. She was presenting a paper, her absence noted immediately. By now, the authorities could no longer dismiss these events as coincidences. 3 people had vanished from Illinois Central trains within a month. The railroad company, terrified of public panic and the economic devastation that would follow if passengers abandoned the line, requested assistance from the Illinois State Police. Detective Samuel Hartwick was assigned to the case. A veteran investigator with the state police, Hartwick had served in Army intelligence during the war and brought a methodical, analytical approach to criminal investigation that was still relatively novel in rural law enforcement. He was 48 years old, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that inspired confidence. More importantly, he understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. Patterns revealed intention, and intention revealed the criminal. Hartwick established his command post in Hickory Bend, the geographic center of the affected area. He requisitioned a small office in the back of the general store and began assembling what we would now call a profile of the crimes. 3 victims, different ages, different genders, different backgrounds. What did they share? They all used the same railroad line. They all vanished without trace. They all were traveling alone. They all were. And this detail struck Hartwick as potentially significant, unremarkable. Not wealthy enough to carry large sums of money, not prominent enough to attract attention, not transient enough to be obvious targets. They were solid, ordinary people who should have been invisible to predators, unless ordinariness itself was the criteria. Hartwick interviewed every station master along the line. He rode the trains repeatedly, observing passengers, studying the conductors, examining the cars. He analyzed the schedules, the timing, the geography. Where could someone overpower a victim without being seen? How could a body be removed without witnesses? The trains were rarely crowded. This was a rural line, but they were never empty. Other passengers existed. Conductors made regular rounds. Railroad employees were present at every stop. The detective's investigation revealed something both mundane and chilling. The trains had dozens of hiding places. Behind boilers, in luggage compartments, in the gaps between cars, in maintenance access areas. And the stops themselves, especially the smaller ones, had blind spots, areas where the platform didn't extend, where forest or buildings blocked sightlines, where someone could disembark unseen. During the brief minutes the train idled. October 23rd, Wednesday, victim number 4, James Sullivan, 61 years old, a retired postal worker traveling from Ashfield to Millerton to visit his daughter. He boarded the evening southbound. His daughter, waiting at Millerton Station, never saw him arrive. The pattern had re-established itself. Wednesday evening, southbound train, victim disappeared between boarding and intended destination. Detective Hartwick intensified his investigation. He obtained permission to assign undercover officers to the train's plainclothes, state police who rode as ordinary passengers, watching, waiting, hoping to witness or prevent the next attack. Railroad detectives joined the effort. Every employee on the line was investigated, their backgrounds examined, their movements tracked. The newspapers caught wind of the story. Headlines screamed variations of "Railroad Killer Stalks Illinois Central Line," and "Phantom of the Rails Claims 4th Victim." Passenger numbers plummeted. The railroad company hemorrhaged revenue. Local communities existed in a state of mounting terror. The very places where notion vile evic had crime was f. lung at her only houri, chua unknown, where the most serious offenses were typically public drunkenness or petty theft. The idea that a serial killer was operating among them hunting them was incomprehensible. The autumn of 1947 deepened. October became November. The trees stood bare. Early snow dusted the fields. The trains continued their runs, now carrying as much fear as freight. November 5th, Wednesday evening, southbound train, Mary Whitmore, 50, 3 years old, traveling from Hickory Bend to Pleasant Grove to help her friend prepare for a wedding. She boarded at 5 p.m. She never arrived. 5 victims, 5 disappearances, still no bodies, no physical evidence, no witnesses to actual violence. Just absence, just empty spaces where people should have been. Detective Hartwick was drowning in theories. Was the killer a railroad employee with intimate knowledge of the trains and schedules? Was it a passenger who regularly traveled the route? Was it multiple killers working in concert? Were the victims being taken for ransom, despite no demands being made? Were they being sold into some form of slavery, though this seemed far-fetched in 1947 America? Were the bodies hidden along the route or transported elsewhere? The detective established a command conference with railroad management and local law enforcement. Every detail was reviewed, every possibility examined. They studied timetables, passenger manifests, employee schedules. They looked for connections between victims' family ties, business dealings, shared acquaintances. They found nothing. And then Hartwick noticed something others had missed: the spacing. The first disappearance, Meadowbrook to Hickory Bend. The second, Riverside to Waynesboro. The fourth, Ashfield to Millerton. The fifth, Hickory Bend to Pleasant Grove. Someone was working their way along the line, stop by stop, selecting victims at different stations but maintaining a geographic progression. Not random, systematic. There were 7 stations on branch line 47. 5 had now been victimized stations where victims had boarded before vanishing. 2 remained untouched, Waynesboro and Millerton, the southernmost stops on the line. If the pattern held, the next victim would board at one of these final 2 stations. Hartwick concentrated his resources. Undercover officers saturated both locations. Every passenger boarding at Waynesboro or Millerton was discreetly shadowed. The detective himself rode the evening trains, watching, waiting. November 12th, Wednesday, evening southbound. Nothing happened. November 19th, Wednesday, evening southbound. Nothing happened. The pattern had broken. Had the killer been spooked by the increased police presence? Had the newspaper coverage driven him to ground? Or was he simply waiting, patient as winter itself? Hartwick maintained the surveillance. Weeks passed. Thanksgiving came and went. December arrived with heavy snow and bitter cold. Passenger numbers remained low. The railroad company faced potential bankruptcy. Local communities remained locked in fear. And then, on December 3rd, a Wednesday, the killer struck again. His name was Arthur Kellerman, 47 years old, a traveling salesman for agricultural equipment. He boarded the evening southbound at Waynesboro, heading to Millerton, where he kept a small apartment. Arthur was known to everyone on the line. He made the trip weekly, always polite, always professional, always carrying his sample case full of equipment catalogs. He never reached Millerton. 6 victims, but this time something was different, because Detective Hartwick had anticipated correctly. Waynesboro had been one of the 2 remaining untouched stations, and when Arthur Kellerman boarded that evening train, 3 undercover state police officers were already aboard, positioned strategically throughout the cars, watching every passenger, every movement. What they witnessed would break the case. The train departed Waynesboro at 7:40 p.m. 5 passengers had boarded there, including Kellerman. The journey to Millerton the final stop, would take approximately 90 minutes with no intermediate stops. This late run serviced only the terminal points. Officer Raymond Tucker was positioned in the second car, dressed as a farmer returning from town. He had a clear view down the aisle. Officer Margaret Billings, one of the first female detectives in Illinois, posed as a young woman traveling to visit family, seated in the third car. Officer Donald Reese occupied the baggage car, hidden among crates and luggage. 20 minutes into the journey, Officer Tucker observed Arthur Kellerman stand and move toward the rear of the third car, apparently heading to the lavatory. This was unremarkable. Tucker made a note of the time 8:02 p.m. and continued his observation. 3 minutes passed, then 4, then 5. Tucker grew alert. The lavatory visits rarely exceeded 3 minutes. He stood casually and moved down the aisle, maintaining the appearance of a passenger stretching his legs. As he passed through the second car into the third, he observed something that sent cold recognition through his chest. Arthur Kellerman's sample case sat abandoned in his seat. His hat rested on the rack above, but Kellerman himself was nowhere visible in the third car. Tucker signaled Officer Billings with a prearranged gesture, a hand to his collar. She nodded, understanding immediately. Tucker continued toward the rear of the car while Billings moved forward, creating a pincer movement. The lavatory door was ajar, empty. Tucker's training took over. Where could a person go on a moving train? The options were limited: forward through the cars toward the locomotive, backward toward the baggage car and caboose, or outside through the exterior doors that passengers were forbidden to use while in motion. The detective moved to the rear door of the third car. It was slightly ajar. Wind whistled through the gap. Cold December air poured into the heated car. Tucker drew his revolver. He signaled to Billings and moved through the door onto the exposed platform between cars. The noise was deafening: the clatter of wheels on rails, the rush of wind, the groan of coupling chains. The temperature was brutal. Snow swirled in the darkness, and there, on the narrow platform, Tucker saw movement. 2 figures struggled in the shadows between cars. One was Arthur Kellerman, bent backward over the railing, his face a mask of terror. The other was someone Tucker had seen before, had observed repeatedly during his weeks of surveillance, but had dismissed as harmless. Daniel Coe, 34 years old, the assistant conductor on the evening southbound train. What Tucker witnessed in those frozen seconds would haunt him for the rest of his life. Coe had Kellerman pressed against the railing, one hand clamped over the man's mouth, the other gripping his collar. The killer's face was utterly calm, no rage, no excitement, just the focused concentration of someone performing a familiar task. "State police, release him." Tucker's shout was barely audible over the train's roar. Coe's head snapped toward the detective. For one suspended moment, the 3 men existed in tableau: hunter, prey, and witness. Then everything accelerated. Coe shoved Kellerman toward Tucker while simultaneously diving toward the baggage car door. Tucker caught the terrified salesman, but lost precious seconds as Coe disappeared through the doorway. Officer Billings emerged onto the platform behind Tucker. He thrust Kellerman toward her. "Take him, officer in baggage car. Warn him." Tucker plunged after Coe into the baggage car. The space was dimly lit, crowded with crates and trunks. Officer Reese was already moving from his hiding spot, alerted by the commotion. Coe was cornered, the caboose ahead blocked by a locked door. "It's over, Coe. There's nowhere to go." The assistant conductor stood between stacks of luggage, his railroad uniform perfectly pressed, his cap still squarely positioned. In the weak light, his face appeared ordinary, neither handsome nor ugly, neither young nor old. The kind of face that disappeared in a crowd, that witnesses forgot, that passengers passed without notice. "You don't understand," Coe said, his voice eerily calm over the train's noise. "They had to be balanced. 7 stations, 7 stops. It has to be balanced." Tucker moved closer, weapon trained. "Where are the bodies, Coe? Where are the other victims?" Something shifted in the killer's expression, not fear, not remorse, but a strange disappointment, as if Tucker had asked a foolish question. "They're where they belong, each one at their stop, each one waiting. Don't you see? The train comes and goes, but they wait forever. 7 stops, 7 guardians, 7. Officer Reese moved to flank from the left. It was a tactical error. Coe erupted into motion with shocking speed, lunging not toward escape, but toward the baggage car's side door, the one used for loading freight at stations. Both officers fired simultaneously. The shots went wild in the moving, crowded space. Coe reached the door and wrenched it open. Wind exploded into the car with hurricane force. The train was traveling at roughly 50 miles per hour through dark Illinois countryside. "Don't!" Tucker shouted. Coe turned in the doorway. Snow whirled around him. In that moment, his face transformed, the calm mask cracking to reveal something desperate, something tormented, something almost pleading. "7, he whispered. "It has to be 7. And then he jumped. The impact of Coe's body hitting the ground at that speed was catastrophic. The train thundered on through the night, but Tucker had already pulled the emergency brake cord. Metal shrieked against metal as the wheels locked. The train took nearly a quarter mile to stop. By the time officers returned to the site of Coe's jump, equipped with lanterns and flashlights, they found his body 50 yards from the tracks. The coroner would later determine that death was instantaneous multiple fractures, massive internal trauma. Daniel Coe had achieved his final escape, but he had taken most of his secrets with him, almost. Because the investigation that followed Coe's death would reveal a horror that explained much but understood little. Detective Hartwick coordinated what became one of the largest searches in Illinois history. Based on Coe's final words, "They're where they belong, each one at their stop," search parties concentrated on the 7 stations along branch line 47. December 4th through 10th, 1947. Teams of police, railroad employees, and volunteers methodically examined every structure, every building, every potential hiding place at each station. They found nothing at Meadowbrook, nothing at Hickory Bend. The searches at Ashfield and Riverside yielded no results. It was at Pleasant Grove on December 7th that the first discovery was made, the water tower. These structures, essential to steam locomotive operation, consisted of a large wooden tank elevated on stilts, accessed by a ladder. Most were rarely entered except for maintenance. The water tower at Pleasant Grove was particularly old, built in the 1890s, scheduled for replacement, but still functional. A maintenance worker climbed the tower to inspect the tank. What he found caused him to vomit over the side before scrambling down to summon authorities. Inside the tank, weighted with chains and preserved by the cold water, were 2 bodies, Martha Henley and Mary Whitmore. Both had been strangled. Both had been carefully weighted to rest on the tank's bottom. Both showed signs of having been placed there shortly after death. The horror of the discovery was compounded by a sickening detail. The water from this tower had continued to service trains throughout October and November. Locomotives had filled their boilers with water that shared space with corpses. Emboldened and sickened, investigators redoubled their efforts. At Waynesboro, they found Robert "Bobby" Tinsdale's body concealed in a ventilation shaft beneath the station building. At Riverside, Elizabeth Carson was discovered in a sealed coal bunker behind the platform. James Sullivan was recovered from a crawlspace in the station master's office at Millerton, hidden literally beneath where William Hadley worked each day, unknown and unsuspected. All had been strangled, all had been carefully concealed, all had been placed at or near the stations where they had boarded trains, exactly as Coe had indicated. 6 bodies recovered, 6 of the 7 victims accounted for, but Arthur Kellerman had survived. The pattern Coe obsessed over, 7 stations, 7 victims, 7 guardians, had been broken at the final moment. The killer's perfect symmetry had been shattered by police intervention. The investigation into Daniel Coe's background revealed a man who had hidden profound psychological disturbance beneath a facade of normalcy. Raised in extreme poverty in southern Illinois, Coe had lost his entire family in a house fire when he was 9 years old. Orphaned, he had been shuttled through a series of foster homes, each placement ending in quiet removal for reasons records didn't fully specify: inappropriate behavior, disturbing incidents. Concerning fixations, he had joined the railroad in 1938 at age 25, working first as a porter, then as assistant conductor. His employment record was unremarkable, competent but not exceptional, punctual, reliable, forgettable. Coe had lived in a boarding house in Hickory Bend, equidistant from all 7 stations on branch line 47. His room, when searched, revealed his inner world. The walls were covered with railroad schedules, maps of the line, timetables annotated in precise handwriting. But more disturbing were the drawings, obsessive, repetitive sketches of the 7 stations, each one numbered, each one annotated with phrases that seemed to reference some personal mythology. First guardian balance begins, second guardian the scales tip, continuing through 7th guardian completion achieved. A journal discovered under his mattress provided fragmentary insights into his thinking, though much of it was cryptic, coded in personal symbolism. Certain passages, however, were chillingly clear. The train is life, perpetual motion without purpose. The stops are death, stillness with meaning. 7 stops to balance the line, 7 souls to anchor the journey. They must wait forever, guardians at their posts, so that others may pass through safely. This is the great work. This is the necessary work. Psychiatric experts who reviewed Coe's writings diagnosed him posthumously as a probable schizophrenic with severe delusional disorder. His fixation on numbers, patterns, and ritualistic balance suggested obsessive, compulsive features. The fire that killed his family had occurred at the family home located near railroad tracks. Investigators theorized that Coe's psyche had somehow merged the trauma of that loss with the railroad itself, creating an elaborate delusional system where he was responsible for protecting the train line through human sacrifice. But theories, however educated, provided little comfort to the communities devastated by his crimes. 6 families had lost loved ones. 6 people had been murdered and hidden in plain sight. The railroad itself had been transformed in public consciousness from a symbol of progress and connection into a corridor of death. The Illinois Central Railroad quietly discontinued service on branch line 47 in 1948. Officially, this was due to declining ridership and economic factors. In truth, passengers had abandoned the route entirely after Coe's crimes became public knowledge. The 7 small stations gradually fell into disrepair. Some were demolished. Others simply rotted away, succumbing to weather and time. The trials that never happened, Coe's death precluding any courtroom reckoning, left many questions unanswered. Why these specific victims? Were they chosen randomly, or had Coe stalked them, studied them, selected them for reasons known only to his fractured mind. How had he overpowered his victims without other passengers noticing? How had he concealed the bodies without witnesses seeing him? Reconstruction of his methods suggested that Coe had used his position as assistant conductor to isolate victims. He would engage them in conversation while checking tickets, learn their destinations, identify those traveling alone. During the journey, he would approach them under the pretense of official railroad business. A problem with their ticket, a question about luggage, a request to move to a different car. In the chaos and noise of a moving train, in the gaps between stations where conductors had discretion and authority, Coe had found his hunting ground. The strangulation had been quick, efficient, practiced. Then came the disposal, waiting until the train stopped at the victim's boarding station, using the brief minutes when other passengers were disembarking or station personnel were distracted, removing the body through service doors, concealing it in predetermined hiding spots he had scouted during his years on the line. The bodies were never transported far from the platforms: the water tower at Pleasant Grove, the coal bunker at Riverside, the ventilation shaft, the crawl space, all within 100 feet of where victims had last been seen alive. The question that haunted investigators most profoundly was the simplest: how long had Coe been killing? 6 confirmed victims across 10 weeks in late 1947, but the Illinois Central Railroad had operated branch line 47 since 1894. Coe had worked the line since 1938, 9 years. Had there been others, missing persons who were never connected to the train? Bodies never found, victims whose disappearances were attributed to other causes. A comprehensive review of missing persons reports from 1938 to 1947 revealed 23 cases along the route that might potentially be connected. 23 people who had vanished under circumstances similar to Coe's confirmed victims. Some had been resolved, runaways found, suicides discovered, accidents explained. But 11 remained unexplained, their fates unknown, their families never finding closure. Search teams re-examined every structure along the abandoned line throughout 1948 and 1949. No additional bodies were recovered. If Coe had killed more than 6, he had hidden those victims so effectively that they remained concealed even after his system was exposed. Or perhaps, as some investigators believed, the autumn of 1947 truly had marked the beginning of his transformation from disturbed individual to active killer, triggered by some internal crisis, some final fracture in his already damaged psyche. Arthur Kellerman, the sole survivor, provided the only first-hand account of Coe in action. Interviewed extensively, Kellerman described how the assistant conductor had approached him roughly 20 minutes into the journey from Waynesboro. Coe had been cordial, professional, mentioning a problem with the baggage car that required Kellerman's sample case to be relocated. Would he mind coming to verify its transfer? Kellerman, trusting the uniform and authority, had followed Coe through the cars to the rear platform. There, in the noise and darkness between cars, Coe had attacked, grabbing Kellerman from behind, one arm around his throat, cutting off air and sound simultaneously. Kellerman had struggled, but Coe was strong, skilled, and had positioned his body to use the train's motion and the cramped space to his advantage. Within seconds, Kellerman had been losing consciousness. Only Officer Tucker's intervention had saved his life. Another 30 seconds, Kellerman believed, and he would have been the 7th victim, completing Coe's obsessive pattern. The psychological impact on Kellerman was profound. He abandoned his career as a traveling salesman, unable to board trains without experiencing panic attacks. The man who had made his living moving from town to town became housebound for nearly 2 years, haunted by those moments on the platform between cars, by the memory of Coe's hands on his throat, by the certain knowledge that he had come within heartbeats of joining the others in their cold, dark hiding places. He eventually recovered enough to find work as a bookkeeper in a small accounting firm. Indoor work, stationary work, safe work. And then, on sound of Tr de terre or INWHI, word STLES, mind tried the kittispdes deisas, SPERATELY, to forget. The communities along the abandoned line struggled to process the trauma. In places like Pleasant Grove and Riverside, where populations numbered in the hundreds, the murders had devastated social fabric. Everyone knew the victims. Everyone had used the trains. Everyone had likely encountered Daniel Coe dozens of times, received ticket checks from him, exchanged pleasantries, trusted him because of his uniform and his unremarkable presence. That betrayal of trust, the revelation that a monster had moved among them wearing the mask of a helpful railroad employee, created a paranoia that lingered for years. Who else might be hiding behind friendly faces? What other predators might lurk in positions of authority and trust? The murders had shattered the fundamental assumption that small communities were safe, that everyone knew everyone, that danger announced itself with obvious signs. Harold Prescott, the station master at Meadowbrook who had sold Martha Henley her final ticket, never fully forgave himself for not sensing something wrong. "I saw her every month," he told a reporter in 1950. "Knew her for years, watched her walk to the platform that last time and felt nothing. No warning, no instinct, no sign from God or anywhere else that she was walking to her death. How do you live with that? How do you trust your own judgment after failing so completely?" Vernon Mills, the elderly station master at Ashfield, developed a drinking problem that cost him his pension. Eugene Cross at Riverside simply abandoned his post one morning in March 1948 and was never heard from again. A disappearance that briefly sparked fears of a second killer before evidence emerged that Cross had simply fled to California to escape his memories. The families of the victims pursued civil lawsuits against the Illinois Central Railroad, arguing that the company had been negligent in screening and supervising employees. The cases dragged through courts for years, most settled out of court for undisclosed sums. The railroad, already financially strained by the loss of the branch line 47 route, never fully recovered its reputation in the region. The company was eventually absorbed in mergers, its identity dissolved into larger corporate structures, the whistle-stop killer becoming a footnote in its history, mentioned in internal documents, with clinical detachment, as if distance and time could sterilize the horror. Detective Samuel Hartwick received commendations for solving the case, though he privately expressed frustration at the outcome. "We stopped him," Hartwick said in a rare interview years later, "but we didn't catch him, not really. He chose his end on his own terms, took his madness with him, left us with bodies and questions but no real understanding. That's not justice. That's just ending." Hartwick continued working for the Illinois State Police until his retirement in 1963. He never forgot the whistle-stop case, never stopped wondering about those 11 unresolved missing persons, never completely shed the suspicion that Coe's crimes had been more extensive than calculated and SIX Chkonkong MURDER thing SPREES in MURDERS. In his later years, he would occasionally visit the sites of the abandoned stations, walking the overgrown platforms, examining the ruins of buildings where horrors had unfolded, searching, perhaps, for some final piece of evidence, some conclusive answer that remained perpetually out of reach. The 7 stations themselves became local landmarks of a dark variety. Urban explorers and ghost hunters were drawn to the ruins, searching for supernatural experiences among the decay. Reports emerged of strange sounds, whistles when no trains ran, footsteps on platforms that no longer existed, voices calling out names in the darkness. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as imagination fueled by knowledge of the murders. Believers insisted the sites were genuinely haunted, that Coe's victims remained bound to the places where they had last lived and first died. In 1973, a documentary filmmaker named Patricia Halloran attempted to create a comprehensive film about the whistle-stop killer. She interviewed survivors, examined archives, reviewed Coe's journals and drawings. The project was never completed. Halloran later stated that the material had become too overwhelming, too disturbing to shape into something coherent. The raw footage, hours of interviews and location shots, remains in a university archive, rarely viewed, a testament to how some stories resist easy narrative. Academic studies of Coe's case appeared periodically in criminal psychology journals. His delusional system, the fixation on numerical balance, the ritualistic placement of bodies, the transformation of normal infrastructure into components of a grand design became a reference point for discussions of psychosis and serial violence. But academic analysis, however thorough, struggled to explain the fundamental mystery: why these particular people? What had Martha Henley, Robert Tinsdale, Elizabeth Carson, James Sullivan, Mary Whitmore, and Arthur Kellerman represented to Daniel Coe? Were they truly random selections, or had some invisible criteria guided his choices? The answer, like so much else about Coe, remains unknowable. His journal entries were fragmentary, cryptic, focused more on the abstract concept of balance and guardians than on the actual human beings he murdered. He had reduced his victims to components in an equation only he understood, stripping them of individuality even as he ended their individuality permanently. This dehumanization, the transformation of complex, complete human beings into mere objects serving a madman's delusion, represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Coe's crimes. Martha Henley was not just a boarding house owner. She was a woman who made exceptional preserves, who visited her sister monthly, who asked about Harold Prescott's wife's hip because she genuinely cared about her community. Robert Tinsdale was not just a farmhand. He was a Navy veteran with dreams of opening a garage, a young man optimistic about the future despite the hardships of his present. Elizabeth Carson taught children, shaped young minds, prepared papers for academic conferences. James Sullivan had spent decades in postal service, connecting communities through reliable mail delivery. Mary Whitmore helped prepare weddings, participated in the joyful moments that knit communities together. Each was a universe of experiences, relationships, hopes, and memories. Each left behind people who loved them, who missed them, who were diminished by their absence. And Daniel Coe had extinguished all of that not in passion or rage, but with cold, methodical precision, in service of a pattern that existed only in his fractured psyche. The whistle-stop killer case reminds us that monsters rarely announce themselves with obvious signs. They don't always look like our cultural image of evil. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they punch time clocks and perform routine duties. Sometimes they live in boarding houses and maintain perfectly normal exteriors while cultivating internal horrors that only become visible when they finally act upon their darkest impulses. The case also reveals how infrastructure we take for granted, trains, stations, the machinery of daily commerce and travel, can be transformed into instruments of death when someone understands that infrastructure well enough to exploit its vulnerabilities. We trust systems, we trust schedules. We trust that the conductor checking our ticket is simply doing their job, that the assistant helping with luggage has benign intentions, that the routine movements of daily life don't conceal predators. Daniel Coe violated that trust systematically. He weaponized normalcy. He turned the familiar into the fatal. And in doing so, he created a legacy of fear that transcended his actual crimes, that made every subsequent train ride for survivors and witnesses an act of courage, that transformed innocent infrastructure into monuments of horror. Questions remain, decades after the last body was recovered from Pleasant Grove's water tower. Were there more victims? The 11 unresolved missing persons cases that investigators identified have never been definitively linked to or excluded from Coe's crimes. Families of those vanished individuals have never received closure, never learned whether their loved ones fell victim to the whistle-stop killer or to some other tragedy. The physical evidence that might answer these questions no longer exists in usable form. The abandoned stations have been demolished or collapsed. The water towers are gone. The buildings where bodies were hidden have rotted away or been replaced. Even if additional remains exist somewhere along that 230-mile stretch, they have long since been reclaimed by nature, scattered by time and weather into atoms indistinguishable from the earth itself. Modern forensic techniques, DNA analysis, criminal profiling, geographic information systems, might have revealed patterns invisible to investigators in 1947. But the opportunity to apply these tools has passed. We are left with the incomplete picture that Detective Hartwick assembled: 6 confirmed murders, 1 survived attack, and a mass of ambiguity surrounding what came before. The psychological profile of Daniel Coe has been refined by subsequent analysis. Contemporary experts believe he likely suffered from schizophrenia with prominent delusional features, possibly complicated by obsessive compulsive disorder and trauma-related dissociative symptoms stemming from the childhood fire that killed his family, his fixation on the number 7, and on creating balance through ritualized murder fits patterns recognized in other cases of delusional serial killers. But understanding the psychological mechanisms doesn't truly explain the why. Why did Coe's particular constellation of trauma and mental illness manifest in this specific way? Thousands of people experience childhood trauma, develop schizophrenia, struggle with delusions. The vast majority never harm anyone. What additional factors, neurological, environmental, experiential, pushed Coe across the line into homicidal action? These questions extend beyond academic interest. Understanding how monsters are made, how systems fail to detect them, how they operate undetected in plain sight, these understandings might help prevent future tragedies. The whistle-stop case has been studied in law enforcement training programs, in criminal psychology courses, in railroad security protocols. The lessons learned about pattern recognition, about the importance of connecting disparate missing persons cases, about the vulnerabilities inherent in transportation systems, have potentially saved lives by informing how authorities approach similar situations today. To this day, the area in Illinois where Branch Line 47 once operated carries the memory of those dark months in autumn 1947. Elderly residents still recall the fear, the uncertainty, the horror of discovery. Younger generations have heard the stories, absorbed the cautionary tale about the assistant conductor who murdered 6 people and hid their bodies at train stations. The actual locations where victims died and were concealed have been largely reclaimed by nature. Fields and forests cover the ground where platforms once stood. Roads have been rerouted. Development has erased or transformed the landscape, but local history preserves the memory. Small historical societies maintain files on the case. Occasional anniversary articles appear in regional newspapers. Ghost tour companies include the abandoned station sites in their routes, though most of what they present is speculation and embellishment rather than documented fact. And on silent winter nights, when snow falls across central Illinois and the wind carries sounds across empty fields, some people claim they still hear train whistles where no tracks remain. They report seeing lights moving along paths where branch line 47 once ran, as if phantom trains continue their runs through time, carrying phantom passengers to stations that no longer exist, while 7 souls wait eternally at their posts, unwilling guardians of a madman's design. Rational explanation attributes these experiences to imagination, to the power of suggestion, to the way wind and distance can create auditory illusions. But rationality struggles in the face of horror this profound. When something this terrible occurs, when the normal world reveals such darkness hiding in its routines, it becomes almost comforting to believe in ghosts, in continued existence beyond death, even if that existence is bound to tragic circumstance. Better to imagine the victims persist in some form than to accept they were simply erased, reduced to nothing by a killer's delusion. The truth, as always, is likely more prosaic and more painful. Martha Henley, Robert Tinsdale, Elizabeth Carson, James Sullivan, Mary Whitmore, and Arthur Kellerman, 6 complete human lives, were ended by Daniel Coe's actions. They don't haunt train stations because they are gone, truly and finally gone, their potential futures erased, their actual pasts reduced to the status of case files and historical footnotes. What haunts those abandoned stations is not ghosts but memory, our collective memory of what happened there, our continuing inability to fully comprehend how such evil flourishes undetected, our persistent anxiety about the monsters that might still move among us, wearing masks of normalcy and carrying credentials of authority. The story of the whistle-stop killer remains a disturbing reminder that safety is often an illusion, that the systems we trust to protect us can be subverted by those who understand their vulnerabilities, that the most dangerous predators are often those who least match our expectations of what evil looks like. Daniel Coe was not a shadowy stranger lurking in darkness. He was an employee, a coworker, a familiar face performing routine duties. His victims didn't wander into danger. They engaged with normal infrastructure, followed regular routines, made ordinary decisions about when to travel and where to go. Their only mistake was existing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, in proximity to someone whose internal landscape had become so distorted that murder seemed not only justified but necessary. But questions remain, hanging in the cold air above those abandoned stations like mist that never quite dissipates. Did Coe claim more victims than the 6 confirmed? What specific criteria guided his selections? What would have happened if Officer Tucker had arrived 30 seconds later, allowing Coe to complete his 7th murder and achieve the balance he craved? Would he have stopped then, satisfied, or would the achievement of his goal have simply redefined his delusion, creating new imperatives, new patterns, new victims? We cannot know. The answers died with Coe on that December night when he leaped from a moving train rather than face capture, choosing his own death with the same cold calculation he had applied to his victims' deaths. In that final act, he denied authorities, families, and history the closure that a trial might have provided. He remained, even in death, in control of his narrative, mysterious and unknowable. To this day, when winter settles across the fields and forests of central Illinois, when snow blank, it's the ground where tracks once ran and stations once stood, people occasionally report hearing train whistles echoing across the landscape, those distinctive patterns, 2 long blasts, 1 short, 1 long, announcing arrivals that will never come. Local folklore has woven the whistle-stop killer into regional ghost stories, complete with embellishments and fabrications. But underneath the sensationalized accounts lies a truth more disturbing than any fiction. For 10 weeks in autumn 1947, death rode the Illinois Central Railroad's branch line 47, and 6 people boarded trains they would never leave alive. The abandoned stations stand as monuments to this dark chapter, those that haven't been demolished, at least. Time and weather have reduced most to barely recognizable ruins. But they persist in memory, in historical records, in the nightmares of survivors and the sorrows of families who never received real justice, only endings. And on the anniversary of each disappearance, some people make pilgrimages to these sites, family members honoring lost loved ones, true crime enthusiasts seeking connection to notorious history, spiritual seekers hoping to sense something beyond the material world. They stand on overgrown platforms or in empty fields, and they remember. They remember that ordinary places can witness extraordinary evil, that trusted systems can harbor predators, that the difference between a safe journey home and a final journey into darkness can be as random and cruel as boarding the wrong train on the wrong evening. If this journey through one of America's most calculated serial murder cases has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the fragile boundaries between normalcy and horror, between the mundane infrastructure of daily life and the terrible uses to which that infrastructure can be put, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the respect and thoroughness they merit. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it reminded you that history's darkest chapters involve real people whose lives and deaths matter, whose stories deserve to be told completely and honestly rather than sensationalized or forgotten. And comment, sharing your own perspectives. How do we balance the need to remember historical horrors with the risk of glorifying perpetrators? How do communities recover from trauma this profound? What responsibility do we bear to ensure similar failures of detection and prevention don't recur? Until next time, may your journeys, whatever form they take, be safe, your destinations reached, your returns home certain. And when you hear train whistles in the distance, let them remind you not of the whistle-stop killer, but of the resilience of communities that survive horror, the dedication of investigators who pursue justice, and the memory of victims who deserve to be remembered as complete human beings, rather than statistics in a killer's delusional equation. The trains no longer run on branch line 47, the stations have crumbled, the killer is long dead. But the story persists, a reminder that vigilance is not paranoia, that questions deserve answers, that the price of civilization is eternal attention to the systems and people we trust without safety. 7 stops along an abandoned rail line, 6 lives lost, 1 survivor, and lessons that echo still across decades, urging us to look more carefully at the familiar, to question the routine, to remember that evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. It wears uniforms, punches time clocks, and waits patiently for opportunity. Remember the victims: Martha Henley, Robert Tinsdale, Elizabeth Carson, James Sullivan, Mary Whitmore, and Arthur Kellerman, who survived to bear witness. Remember the lesson: trust but verify, connect the patterns, question the familiar, remember the cost of forgetting.